Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
In today's news, we are going to dig into some zombie archaeology. As we know, the dead sometimes travel, and as we'll see, our ancient ancestors often went to great lengths to either facilitate or to stop them from doing that. For our first story, let's go to the village of Oppin in the German state of Saxony-Anhalt. There, the local Heritage Management and Archaeology Office announced the findings of a zombie grave dating back 4,200 years all the way to the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age time period. Now, what do we mean by zombie grave? So let's start with the basics. What they did find was the skeleton of a 40 to 60-year-old man who you can see is not all that well preserved, but it was enough that they could very roughly age the skeleton at the time of death. He was a member of the Bell Beaker culture at that time, which, if you recall, many of these ancient archaeological cultures were named after the types of ceramics and pottery they left behind, which in this case looked like this. So hence the name Bell Beaker. Well, what we've long suspected thanks to the archaeology, and we now know thanks to ancient DNA, these Bell Beaker folks came all the way from that Eurasian steppe which we've talked about, and came to dominate much of Europe. However, as powerful as they were still afraid of the dead coming back to life to haunt them. How do we know? Because for some of them, rather than being buried with the usual Bell Beaker, again, that's how they got their name, they were buried in other sorts of creative ways which seemed to be trying to stop them from rising again. So in the case of this zombie burial, that was by the giant rock placed on his legs so he couldn't get up and walk the earth again. They call that a revenant. In other cases, the dead were simply buried face down, the thinking being that they would be confused, clawing their way further down into the earth rather than up to the surface.
You're a stupid dumbass.
And what is so cool and kind of creepy is how long these beliefs persisted, well into the early modern era and in most of Europe. And Poland in particular is a hotbed for these kinds of creepy burials. Now, they're so common that there's actually a fancy archaeological name for the burials, and that's called Deviant. These are burials in which the dead seem to be punished or marginalized in some form, so their treatment is different than others. So we find burials face down with their hands or feet tied, with sickles across their neck, presumably so their head would get sliced off if they tried to rise, with padlocks around their feet, or with wooden stakes through their heart.
I know what you are. Vampire.
And look, this one even had its head in a box.
Ah, no, but that's very creative.
Okay, so that last one was fake news, but you get the idea. People over time were very creative with these deviant and zombie burials. So the one that was announced was nothing totally new for me, but it was much older than I realized because I'm mostly familiar with these in a medieval or late Roman context. So the fact that they were doing this 4,200 years ago, up until 200 or 300 years ago, to me is pretty amazing. And now off to Baltinglass, Ireland, where archaeologist James O'Driscoll has found what he believes are roots for the dead.
Columbia Building, 57th Street. I'm in a hurry, so let's not dawdle.
Whoa, that's quite a claim. So what exactly did he find? Well, to be specific, he found a cluster of 5 of a certain kind of monument, an ancient monument called a cursus. So, what's a cursus, you ask? Actually, it's kind of a misnomer, because in the 1700s, William Stukeley, who was perhaps Britain's most famous antiquarian, sort of a forefather to modern archaeology, well, he compared one of Britain's most famous cursuses, and more about that in a moment, to the Roman circus, which was a chariot racing track. But anyway, it's a Neolithic structure, a ditch usually in circular form, sometimes embellished with wooden posts. And these date back all the way to the Neolithic period, so 4,000 to 6,000 years old in most cases. And they tend to come in clusters, often found in Scandinavia, Britain, and France. And believe it or not, Stonehenge is located within a cursus, a ditch, circular in form, and that's exactly the one that Stukely was looking at when he first used that phrase, cursus, comparing it to the Roman circus. Also, just like Stonehenge, many of these are associated with burials, many are located near or aligned with rivers, and many of them, interestingly, are aligned with certain celestial events like solstices or eclipses. Given how old they were and that they are prehistoric, not much concretely is known about these things, and they're often not really excavated. So in Ireland, where we're going today, there have only been 25, I believe, that have been found, and there's only been one that has been properly excavated and dated, and that would be Newgrange, where I visited just last year. And what's so cool about Newgrange is, on the winter solstice during sunrise, I believe that is the only time that the sun illuminates the inner chamber in the center, and that happens through a little hole above the portal. It's such a rare occurrence that there's actually a special lottery for tickets just on that day. But anyway, I digress. And so what did O'Driscoll do? Well, he used our old friend LiDAR and identified 5 of these cursuses near Baltinglass, making that the largest cluster of them ever found in Ireland. And if you look at them, their shape, some of them at least, is rather oblong, not circular. Moreover, there are plenty of interesting archaeological features in the area, like a hill fort, but for the purposes of our zombie archaeology, the most interesting were some cairns that were actually aligned with the cursuses. What's a cairn? Well, it's a Neolithic monument usually made of stacked stones and often associated with burials, as were these. So we've got 5 of these things in close proximity, placed around a bunch of burials that are located seemingly strategically in the landscape, like next to rivers or on top of prominent hills. And remember, in the Neolithic, as we see at Stonehenge, rivers often seem to have a sacred association, often with death. However, the big tell was that these cursuses also had a celestial alignment towards the rising sun of the summer solstice. So putting it all together, the burials, the placement in the landscape, the alignment with the solstice, and O'Driscoll determined this cluster as a route between the living and the dead. And there's a fancy archaeological term for this kind of place called a liminal space. That's a space that exists uneasily between two things, usually the space for the living and the space for the dead, as we see in this case. And doesn't this sound familiar to something we've heard before? You guessed it, that would be Mike Parker Pearson's interpretation of the Stonehenge landscape. And in fact, O'Driscoll does cite Parker Pearson in this paper that he's just published. So are these highways for the dead? Honestly, nothing from so long ago in the distant past can be too rock solid, but given the association with the features in the landscape, the burials, the river, and the sky, that's about as good a guess as any. So that's it for today's spooky archaeology news. Halloween in May.
Remember, stay out of the daylight!
Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.